All right, so in this next unit, we're going to talk about working with files. So we're going to talk about inputting files into either our console or into our application that we can read and manipulate some of the data. And then we're going to speak at the end about how to go ahead and write to files with Python. Now there's a lot of different ways to do this and a lot of different tools that we can use in order to do this, but what we're going to use is we're going to use something called Pandas. And the reason we're going to use Pandas is essentially it's one of the most popular or important external libraries for data science in Python. And I realize we may not only be using Python for data science, but this is going to be one of those external libraries that you're going to use a whole lot. The other reason is that you're going to be working with external libraries a whole lot within Python. And so this is a good opportunity for us to look at import, whether it's a built-in library or pulling data for code or applications from another class or function, or whether it's pulling external libraries, we're going to use the import function. So in this particular session, we're going to use Panda for storing data. So we're going to write to files with Panda. We're going to use it for loading data and reading files, manipulating data, analyzing data. So we're just going to do some basics. Again, we're going to use baseball for this, of course. I will put a link to the data that we're going to be using, the CSV file, so that you can use it as well. So you can just download that and use it accordingly. So Panda is going to use what we call data frames. So it's a container for storing tabular data. So we're going to be doing most everything that we're doing right now is within a data frame. We're going to continue along that line probably for a couple more units, but just in general, so you know that this data frame is just tabular data is what we're going to be looking at here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to need to import our data from Panda or using Panda, and we're going to import our data from a CSV file that we have ready. So let me go into, I'm going into Spider, and I'm using REPL within Spider. And I'm basically just going to start with an import statement. And just remember, as we're in REPL, as long as we're continuing on in the same session, it's going to store all of this information. So we're only going to have to do this once unless we do a clear reset. So we're going to do import pandas as PD. Typically, you'll see in applications or in Python code, people will use PD to point to pandas. So if you see PD in code, typically it's going to be pandas, but import pandas is PD, and then we're also going to import path from OS. So these are two ways that we're going to, or two things that we're going to need to import in order to access our data. And then we're just going to put in our data directory. So where are we going to store? So we're going to store it in this constant right here, this data directory. And in my case, I put it all on my desktop, and I recommend you just work from your desktop as well. It's easier to find everything, but whatever works for you is fine. So there's my desktop that I'm going to put in. And again, it's just storing this information. So we're not seeing any information yet. It's just storing it. We're not getting any errors. Everything seems to be going smoothly, but we'll find out in just a few seconds as we test all of this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to read files into Pandas, and as I mentioned, I have a CSV file that you can download and use. And what this is this is just an output of the leaders within fantasy baseball right now. So who are the top leaders with home runs, stolen bases, RBIs, etc. Just so we have a list of players that we can be working with. Figured this is a real easy CSV file to work with. And because we're doing this with fantasy baseball leaders, I'm just going to call this fantasy leaders. So this is the data, I'm calling the data or data frame that I'm going to be working from, fantasy leaders. And all throughout, I want to make sure that I'm using it the same way. So the same casing, I'm starting with a lowercase and then an uppercase for each additional word, but I'm doing fantasy leaders. And we're going to say PD, which we pull from that import statement. So we're saying we're using a method within Pandas to read a CSV file. And we need to tell Pandas where that CSV file is. So we're going to do what's called a path join, which means we're going to take various pieces of information and join them together. So we're going to take our directory. We're going to take the folder within that directory. And then we're also going to let it know the name of the file. So in my case, I named the file Fantasy Leaders, and I used today's date. So as of today, .csv, don't forget to make that in quotes. And so now I'm saying that I'm going to use Fantasy Leaders. That's basically going to be reading from a CSV file located in Baseball Python folder on top of my desktop. And so just to test this, I want to make sure everything's working. We're going to use something called, or a method called head. And so what head's going to do is it's usually going to put, by default, the top 5 rows and columns, or its top 5 rows, I should say, and then the columns across the board of the data that we're looking at. So we want to make sure that our connection is working. And it's not going to be very pretty, because in this particular case, I think we have like 20 columns, but it's going to give us just a sampling of the data and let us know if we're doing it right. So fantasy leaders.head, you can see that there's an index next to it, which we'll talk about, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So as you know, in Python, we start counting from 0, not from 1. But then there's also, within that CSV file, there is a column called rank. So you can see who's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it's not going to show us all of the columns here. It's just going to give us a taste of the data so we can make sure that we're seeing the information properly. So we did our connection, data directory is working, we're reading the file, and we're pulling all of this in from a CSV file. We don't have to open up the CSV file anywhere else. We don't have to make sure it's closed or locked by anything. It's just pulling into the Python session here. Now, because we can't see everything, we just want to make sure that it is really getting the information, and we're going to pull this information later. So we may want to know, and I'm sure we are, as we start going into crunching the data a little bit, what are the fantasy leaders columns that are in here? Fantasy leaders columns. Whoops, I wasn't supposed to have the parens. I was wondering why I got that error. But anyway, so fantasyleaders.columns. So columns is telling me these are all the columns that I have that I can pull from. So I have information about rank, name, team, position, etc. The other thing I can do is, just to make sure I'm getting everything, is I can use the shape. And shape is going to tell me not only, it's not going to tell me names of anything, it's going to tell me how many columns I have and how many rows of data I have. So I have 596 rows of data across 21 different columns. So I can get a pretty good idea of the data that I'm working with. I now know the columns that I can pull from. I now know the amount of data that's in here, and I've done a head to make sure that I'm getting the data appropriately. So what I want to be able to do then is maybe focus on specific data, because there's a lot of information in here, and maybe I just want kind of a list of the top 5 players. So I got that with doing head, but I wanted to clean it up a little bit. So what I can do is I can take my fantasy leaders object that I created, and I could say, I can give it a column name and say I just want to know, everybody in the fantasy leaders name, and instead of putting everybody again, I can just do the head method and say, okay, here's my top 5 people in this list. So those are my top 5 players. But maybe as I'm looking at those top 5 players, I want to be able to say, okay, name is fine. Why are they top 5? So let's look at some of the statistics, because this is baseball. We deal with statistics. So we're going to say fantasy leaders. Now we're going to have to put a double bracket here. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to have a list of different columns that are going to be separated into the brackets, and then we're going to need to close it off. So you'll see how this kind of looks. So let's say we want to know name. We know that's a field, and we want to make sure that these are spelled properly. So we have this on our screen right now, what the column names are. We're going to pull name, team, let's pull position. Want to know what their primary position is that they're playing. Of course, home runs, can't go wrong. Runs batted in, so RBI, and then maybe stolen bases. Those are the categories we typically are going to have in our fantasy baseball And so I can do fantasy leaders, and I can pull name, team, position, home runs, runs batted in, stolen bases. Again, I'm going to default to the top 5, so I'll just say head. I can do the entire list if I want, but we're just going to do that. And it's going to say, okay, Shohei Ohtani, he's from the Angels, he's a DH, he's got 30 home runs, 66 RBI, and 12 stolen bases. And you can compare them right underneath to Vlad Jr. A little less on the home runs, a little more on the RBIs, a lot less on the stolen bases. And so you can kind of compare them and say, okay, well, these are basically the top players right now in fantasy baseball. And we're just getting this data. We're just manipulating the data right now. We're analyzing it. We're not writing to anything. We're not affecting the text file that we brought in. So we're not damaging anything. It's just a copy of it. And we can just start playing with the numbers and seeing how everything's working. So we're manipulating the data a little bit. The other thing we can do is we can also change the index. So here the index starts at 0. What we can do is we can set the index to be maybe rank. So instead of Shohei Ohtani being ranked 0 and Vlad Guerrero being ranked number 1, it really should be Shohei Ohtani's ranked 1 and Vladimir Guerrero's ranked 2. So we could use something like a set index. And then we'll do it based on rank. And then we can do the top 5 again, and now it's instead of showing that index 0, 1 through 4, we've now got rank being the column that we're setting things as. So it's probably easier to read, makes a lot more sense, especially when you get later in the numbers. You may have people's ranks wrong because it's using the index value of -1 or -1. So that's our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, typically what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to search through our data. So we can create a subset of that data, for example, or maybe we want to narrow some things down. So we can use an operator. You know, we've used a couple other operators here. We've used columns and shapes, but we can use an operator here that is going to help us narrow down the data. Because maybe what we want to do is we want to take a 596 rows of data, and we actually just want to get a subset. Maybe we just want a file that we can work on later that's just a particular team, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull a subset of the data, and then what we're going to do is we're going to write that data to a file. So it's going to show us how we're bringing data in. It's going to show us how we can basically filter the data with an operator here, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to write that data somewhere else. So we're still going to use our fantasy leaders object, but what we're going to do is we're going to create a new object. And so we're going to say it's going to be called fantasy leaders, and we're going to do underscore. And this is just a naming convention. You can do whatever you want. This is how I would do it. Do fantasy leaders and underscore. What is this subset of data going to be? It could be home runs, runs batted in. Maybe I want to see who has the most stolen bases. In my case, as you know, I'm a Dodger fan, so I just want to see what are the Dodgers doing that are in the top 600 of the fantasy leaders here. That's all I care about. So I'm going to say fantasy leader Dodgers. And what I'm going to assign to this is I'm going to use this object, fantasy leaders, and I'm going to use the .loc to locate an array. It's a locate operator. So it's not locate as in location like geography. It's basically saying I'm looking for a specific filter or subset of data or arrays within the data that I'm going to pull. So it's a .loc, and I'm going to pull that from the fantasy leaders object again. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to use it based on team, and that team is going to be equal to the LA Dodgers. And I'm going to close that off. So again, I've got a name for my subset, fantasy leaders underscore Dodgers. I'm going to do fantasy is equal to fantasy leaders, the object dot using the LOC operator, and then within the fantasy leaders object, I'm going to pull the team column and say where a row is equal to LAD within the team column. And so I've pulled all that data together. So if I want to see ahead of what that looks like, or actually I can just see the whole thing, I can say fantasy leaders underscore Dodgers, and there's my list here. So Chris Taylor is the top ranked Dodger, followed by Max Muncy, Justin Turner, Mookie Betts, etc. So I can see that list. So I can see that I've gotten all of the Dodgers that I wanted to pull out, or I can do what we've been doing before, pull ahead, and it'll give me the top 5, but at the bottom it's telling me there's 21 Dodgers within this list. So the last thing we're going to do today is just output this. So we've pulled a file in, we've analyzed the data, we've filtered it, we've created new objects with it. So we're doing the basics that we would do with a file, pulling in external data, and we'll talk about later how you can pull in other types of external data. Today is just CSV. But what I may want to do is now output this data to a new CSV. So instead of having my Fantasy Leaders CSV, I'm now going to have a new file that's Fantasy Leaders just for the Dodgers. So what I'm going to do is take that object that I created, that Fantasy Leaders or subset that I created, Dodgers, and we did the read CSV before. Now what we're going to do is do two CSV. So we're going to send it to a CSV, and we're going to tell it where to go. So just like we did before, we're doing path join. So we're saying we've got our data directory that we've already assigned. We're going to put it in the same folder, baseball Python. And then we're going to go to fantasy leaders underscore Dodgers.csv is the name of the file that I'm going to say. And then what I'm also going to do is I don't want to mess up with any indexes or anything like that, and I don't want to put the index starting at 0, so I don't want to create a column with that. So I'm just going to say index equals false. I don't really care about the index, and I don't want that in my file. So I'm going to say index equals false, and if I hit enter, then we'll see that it was done. And so if I open up, and pause this for a second and I'll open this up. So if I open up my baseball Python folder, you'll see I now have two files here. One of them fantasy leaders underscore Dodgers.csv. And if I double click on this, it's probably going to open in numbers. And there's the data that I just pulled from. So I went from having an entire file of fantasy leaders with the 500 in it, and real quickly with Python, I just created a subset with 21 rows. And you can see it kept the ranks. It did not keep any of the index numbers, which is fine. That's exactly what I wanted. And I've got all the data that I had before, but now it's just a subset. So that was just a real quick overview on reading and writing, or inputting files and writing to files or exporting files with Python.